Hello, and welcome to episode 213 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other assignments. How are you, Bill? And welcome back to the good old USA.
Thank you very much, Seth, and I appreciate all the great comments from folks talking about my recent move. This is several episodes later after I made the move to Cocoa Beach, Florida, but move was successful. Had a great trip to Japan. We'll talk about that at some future date, and I'm glad to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're glad to have you back. Glad to have you back in the good old States here. Before we get into today's topic, I just wanted to throw this in there for you guys who watch us on YouTube. Please do like and subscribe. I know, and I say it at the end of every episode, but I get the strong suspicion that as soon as we start wrapping our conversation, a lot of you guys click off and move on, and that's fine. But I do implore you to like and subscribe to our channel and the individual videos, because that does help the algorithm and YouTube throw our channel out to other people who might be interested in this topic, and that helps us get our information out to the masses a little bit easier. So if you are watching on YouTube and you haven't liked and subscribed, specifically subscribed, please do so. It would mean a lot to Bill and I, and we would greatly appreciate it. Now, with that being said, on with the show. U.S. submarine skippers during World War II, at least the good ones, were by nature gamblers, pirates, adventurers, revolutionaries of the tactical kind, and daredevils, simply put. The good skippers would often, quote, forget pre-war doctrine on how to operate a submarine. They would neglect to dive when maybe they should have. They would risk life and limb to sink an enemy ship, often penetrating enemy harbors, sailing into shallow waters, narrowly avoiding mines and submarine nets, just to get that kill, just to sink one more ship. The really good skippers like Dick O'Kane, Mush Morton, Sam Dealey, and others like them pushed the envelope even further, chasing down enemy ships on the surface, sometimes in broad daylight, in aircraft and destroyer-infested waters. These uber-aggressive skippers were driven to succeed more than their contemporaries, sometimes pushing the limit between recklessness and courage, and a line that often became a bit blurred. Much of the time, these aforementioned uber-aggressive skippers were not only daredevils and pirates, they were leaders. True, honest-to-God leaders that inspired the men under them to go with them on those dangerous, often crazy missions. One such man was a skipper who is generally cited as being the most ingenious, revolutionary, and truly compassionate leaders of all the men I just mentioned. He was a legend during the war and remains so to this day. That, of course, is Eugene Flucky and his beloved USS Barb. Now, Bill, you knew Admiral Flucky, didn't you?
Yeah, I got to know him a little bit. I don't want to exaggerate my relationship with him, but I did get a sit down with him when I was about to take command of USS Indianapolis, the submarine. And one of my most proud possessions is a copy of his book, Thunder Below, who are astute readers and watchers are undoubtedly familiar with. And the reason it's one of my most prized possessions is this inscription here by Admiral Flucky, who says to Commander William J. Tody, super person, super achiever, super submariner. And he goes on. But I mean, to hear Gene Flucky, who, as you said, was not only an aggressive submariner in World War II, but one of the most innovative submariners ever to live. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. And to have him call me a super submariner, undeserved as it might have been, is just one of those things, one of those pinch me moments. And honestly, I'm not ashamed to admit that when he said these things and wrote those words down, I almost teared up, Seth.
I don't blame you. I mean, I don't blame you at all. I had, I didn't know any sub skippers. I knew sub crewmen, but, in different units and different, guys that I knew over the years that we've talked about, like Swede Vedeza, who's personal hero and a personal friend of mine, one time called me a fellow Reaper, a Grim Reaper. And that, about made my heart stop, because I ain't nothing like the Grim Reapers. But I understand where you're coming from. And to hear those words from people that you admired,
idolize.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
your whole life. It does mean quite a lot. So, Flucky he's in that upper echelon, and we're going to talk about Gene specifically in just a few minutes. We're going to kind of go through the prologue, if you will, but he's in that upper echelon of sub skippers with Dick O'Kane, with Mush Morton, Sam Dealey, Creed Burlingame, people like that are in that. There's this list, and then there's this list, and he's in that list. He's in that list for sure, and we're gonna explain why he's in that small category of just incredible skippers here in just a bit. But let's talk about before he got a hold of Barb. Barb was a Gato class boat. She was one of the first Gato class boats, as a matter of fact, and she had been on several patrols long before Gene Flucky ever got a hold of her. She was in the Atlantic, which is something that I don't think a lot of our viewers, and we're not going to talk about that because we're in the Pacific War, but there were a lot of Atlantic-based submarines that were on patrol during the war. That people, you think of subs in World War II in the U.S., you think of Pacific, you don't think of Atlantic. But Barb spent 5-6 patrols in the Atlantic before she ever got to the Pacific?
Yeah, that's right. And the reason it seems to be a footnote in history is because from an operational combat standpoint, the Atlantic patrol boats didn't do much. Now that, as I've said repeatedly in our podcast, just going to sea in a submarine is dangerous. Sure. Even when you're not under fire, the ocean's trying to kill you, even when the enemy isn't. So I don't want to minimize the risk that these submariners took and the importance of these missions off of, for example, one of the Barb patrols was off of the North Africa during Operation Torch, searching for German raiders while operating out of Scotland, Holy Loch, Scotland, which we operated out of for decades. And then in June 43, a year after she was commissioned, she was sent to New London for a much deserved overhaul, following her 5th war patrol in the Atlantic, which is incredible. But really, she didn't start to move the needle on writing history of submarine warfare until she got transferred to the Pacific.
Yeah, and even then, she didn't really until Lucky Flucky got his fingers into her, and then she made history. Now, to what you were saying there, Bill, when Barb gets to Pearl Harbor, this is after her overhaul. She goes on another war patrol, which would be her 6th war patrol, and she really doesn't net much. But at this time, she's assigned a PCO, and you've gone through what that is, a prospective commanding officer, who that would ride with her on her next patrol and would ultimately take command of the submarine. Now, you'd mentioned specifically that didn't happen very often, that when a PCO was assigned to a boat, he was just going to the boat to see if he was worthy of being a sub skipper. He probably wasn't taking that boat. One of the only other instances we know that happened, of course, is Mush Morton and Wahoo. But that's right. Same kind of thing happens here, though.
Yeah, and it was unusual. Like I said, when you'd screen for command, you'd gone through PCO school, and then it wasn't unusual to take that PCO and let him ride for a patrol, just to get that experience under his belt. He wasn't the CO, he was the prospective commanding officer. But as I said before, normally after you get that ride, you go take command of another boat, because if you want to make, if you're going to make mistakes as the PCO, the submarine force leadership doesn't want you making mistakes in front of your crew. Make those mistakes in front of some other crew. So when you take command, you kind of come in with a fresh slate. But this is one of those situations like with Mosh on Wahoo, where a guy rides as PCO and then takes command of the very same boat.
Yeah, it's not very common. I mean, you know better than I when it comes to this kind of stuff, but I can only remember it happening twice. These 2 times specifically, Wahoo and Barb. Well, of course, on Barb's 7th patrol, this is where this young PCO comes. Well, he's not really even that young, frankly. He's a little bit older than most, but a little bit younger than some, kind of in the middle of the age bracket there. He rides on Barb on her 7th war patrol. And with the pushing, And that's exactly what he does. With the pushing of this PCO, Barb sinks her first ship. Now, think about this for a second. This is her seventh war patrol, and she just sank her first ship. So it's not that the former skipper of Barb was timid or not good. I mean, the first 5 patrols, as we said, was in the Atlantic. The pickings were slim. And when he went to the Pacific, he was one of those older skippers that did go by the pre-war book. And the PCO was certainly not that kind of a guy.
Right.
The PCO that is assigned, of course, to Barb is the gentleman that we're going to talk about here now. It was a gentleman by the name of Eugene Flucky. Now, Flucky, Bill, let talk about Flucky. Who was he? Where did he come from? How did he get to this spot?
Yeah, the joke about Washington, D.C. is nobody's actually ever born there. They only work there. But in truth, there's a lot of people who were born there. And Gene Flucky was one of them. He was born in 1913. As a student, he was superb, excelled in science, graduated from high school at age 15. That's incredible, right?
Yeah.
And as a young man, Flucky had his heart set on Annapolis. I mean, that's not far from DC, right, where he was born and grew up. But he was too young to get into Annapolis. So he attended the Naval Academy Preparatory School, which I think at the time was in it was in Newport, Rhode Island still. It moved during, but I think it was in Newport. And then attended the prep school to get him ready for the Naval Academy, entering the academy in 1931, graduating in 35. And just like everybody else in those days, he initially served in the surface fleet. His first service was on the battleship Nevada, later USS McCormick. So he had a good foundation in surface warfare, but he was on, he wanted something different. So in 1938, he applied for and entered submarine school, then as now in New London, Connecticut. And upon graduation, he went to the old S-boat. I think it was S-42, where he was stationed in the Panama Canal Zone. We had submarines stationed there. Remember what submarines did in those days were basically coastal patrol, just like we had submarines stationed in the Philippines in those days, and for doing coastal patrol kind of work. Following his S-boat service, he was assigned to USS Bonita in 1941 during the war, and actually served for 5 war patrols in the canal zone. So, why? But that's what we did.
Yeah. What the heck are you going to see in the canal zone in the submarine? I don't know, but I get it. There was a legitimate fear, and we can talk about this in another episode, but there was a legitimate fear that the Japanese were going to attack the Panama Canal. It was a legitimate.
Which would have made it really hard to get between fleets. And so, it's something worth defending. I'm not sure submarines are the thing to defend it. That's kind of my point. And I think we eventually figured that out.
Yeah. And just to give the listeners an idea, you say he graduated from the Academy class of 35. Mush Morton was class of 34. Dick O'Kane was class of 36. So he's smack right in between. So that'll give you an idea on the age and the experience level of Lucky Flucky as he's getting into service with Barb. Now, he desperately wanted to get into combat. He was a married man. He had a daughter. I can't remember. I think his daughter's name, ironically enough, was Barbara, completely unrelated to his command, but it's one of those things. But he desperately wanted to get into combat. He knew where the fighting was. He knew everything was going down in the Pacific. He wanted to get out there bad. And seemingly at every turn that he tried to get out there, something happened, and something recalled him to one station or another, and he couldn't get his tail to where he wanted to be. And finally, he gets assigned as the PCO for Barb as she's going out on this patrol. And the thing is, too, which I found to be pretty interesting that he said in his book, is that even after PCO school, just before he got aboard Barb, he was assigned to supervise a repair of fleet boats. He's like, come on, man, let me go do what I want to do. He just seemingly couldn't get out. He couldn't get out.
But it's an extremely critical duty. Remember, we talked about this before. When boats came back from patrol, the crew would go to the Royal Hawaiian Hotel for R&R. They basically leave the submarine to the repair crew. And the repair crew would do all the maintenance on the submarine and get it ready for the next patrol. When it was done, the crew would come back from the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. Wonderful hotel, by the way. I'll be there this summer. And they would, go back to the submarine. But it was really critical work that he was doing here, was overseeing the repair of the boats during that inter-patrol repair period. As important as that was, it was not a good use of his skills because he was a warfighter.
Yeah, he was a warrior, to be sure. So he does eventually, finally, get command of Barb. He takes command of Barb while the sub is at Midway. The crew of Barb, by all accounts, had grown rather weary of their patrols in which they had netted virtually nothing. And there were a lot of guys who they were plank owners. They'd been on her for all of her patrols. They were like, you know what, this just isn't working out. There's a lot of other boats that are making, they're coming back with full bags. It's time to move on. And seemingly when Flucky got aboard, literally within like 24, 48 hours, a lot of those opinions started to change. And that they realized that once this guy started getting around the boat and started talking to people, that he was a different breed of skipper. And a lot of the guys that had ideas of getting off Barb were like, let me give it one more try and see what happens here. He's just that kind of a guy, wasn't he, Bill?
Early advocate of what we now call management by walking around, or MBWA. As was, frankly, was Mush, right? Mush used to walk around and wrestle with his crew members. Now, Gene didn't do that. He kept prim and proper, but he loved the crew. He stretched the rules as it pertained to crew morale, much like Mush did. We sort of walking around in his underwear and wrestling to the ground. But he did other things like, splice the main brace is the Navy expression for drinking. So he would have alcohol on board, and he would give the crew a reward of alcohol after a successful attack, for example. Let me tell you, that's not conventional, and that was not common. But he was willing to ignore rules as it pertained to improving crew morale. He figured they're risking their lives, they're giving up their life, happy life, and I'm going to try to give them as much as I can in return for that.
Yeah, and I mean, we've talked about this ad nauseum that morale is a huge thing, and especially on a naval vessel, especially a submarine where the crew is already small. And bad morale can spread like the flu, and good morale can do the same thing. And Flucky was no fool. He was fully aware of that. He'd seen the faces of the guys on the boat before he took command. He knew that it wasn't, an unhappy boat, but he also knew that, it wasn't doing what it needed to do. So to your point, he was willing to break the rules, bend the rules, whatever you say, to make sure that his crew was happy when they performed to their utmost, which of course they do time and time again. He was one of those natural leaders, though, like Mush Morton, like Dick O'Kane, although O'Kane was a different personality, but he was one of those natural leaders that people just gravitated towards, that they just wanted to do things for him. They wanted to go wherever he wanted to go. And if he said, hey, let's do this, they were, without even thinking, they were all aboard. They were all about it. And that's the kind of leader that you need.
Seth, even when I met him, he had this infectious personality, unbridled enthusiasm, and it was really contagious. He was sitting there with me, and I'm guessing he must have been late 70s. I don't know exactly how old he would have been in 1996. I could probably do the math. But, the point is, he's sitting there and his personality is exuberant. He's really outgoing and excited about, with Dick O'Kane, when I met him, he was very staid and deliberate and talked about submarines won the Cold War. Submarines won World War II. You can be part of the force that wins the Cold War, which we eventually did. But he wasn't enthusiastic, energetic cheerleading. Even at the age I met, Gene Flucky. He was enthusiastic, and heck, you already had me at this point. I was a PCO, right? He didn't need to try to convince me that what we were doing was worthwhile, but he just exuded that exuberance that just was so infectious. And boy, he would have been our best recruiter if we could have got him to the academy to convince people to go submarines. Maybe they did at some point. I'm not sure. It didn't happen when I was there. But, you know, I think that he was just somebody that you couldn't not like. Does that make sense? You had to
totally
like.
does.
I'll say it.
Yeah, no, it totally does. It totally does. One of his officers, Lieutenant Tuck Weaver, said of him, he said, quote, "He was a no pain, no strain, easy on the nerves individual whose good-humored, upbeat personality was infectious. He had a unique and wonderful ability to make all of those around him feel good about life. He made them better than they really were," unquote. That's just a good dude. That's just a good guy.
A good dude. Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes everybody feel better. And he did joke around. You didn't, not to the extent that Mush Morton did, you know, physical, you know, humor or anything, but he, you know, he understood that, look, this can't be all pressure getting you down all the time. When you're on a submarine, crew's compressed, you have no privacy. There's a lot of pressure from just the operations of the boat. And so he did try to, you know, raise people's morale through levity. You know, he knew everybody by their first name. He knew their family status, their traits, their quirks. He quickly learned who he could rely on, which, as he found out, was all of them, which is incredible.
Right.
You know, when I was CO, I used artificial methods like very intense training periods where I would cause the crew to go without sleep for long periods of time. And people get agitated by that. We're just training. You know, why won't you let me sleep? Well, the reason I didn't let them sleep was because you really learn who you could rely on and who would fold when they got tired. And he was doing the same kinds of things. I didn't know it, but he was doing the same kinds of things even in World War II.
Yep. He you know, and another thing about him was, aside from being just a natural born leader, and I'm one that is convinced that leaders are born, they're not made, they are born. There are certain people that are put on this earth to be leaders of men. He was one of them. He was also a very naturally curious guy. Like, he liked to experiment with things. And I'm not just talking about submarines. I'm like different things. He liked to mess around with different things and see how they worked and take them apart and rebuild them. And, you know, typically just very curious, naturally curious individual. Most highly intelligent people are like that, by the way. He was a firm believer in the tactics that were prophesized by our good friend Mush Morton, you know, that submarines don't always have to be submerged, that they should, frankly, run on the surface. They can get to their patrol areas faster. They can make end arounds and surface attacks in a much more, you know, timely manner and more efficient manner than plunking down, you know, 24 hours a day. He was a firm believer in that. And as we will see, he used it all the time. But, you know, he was this naturally curious guy that by the end of the war literally revolutionized the way submarines were used then and are used still today because of him.
And we're going to talk about this because so much of what he did, it was the first time it had ever been done. And to some extent, I fear that we've kind of lost, our current submarine force has lost that edge of experimentation and innovation. You know, we could use another Gene Flucky, but I agree. He would override throttles to see in an emergency how fast his submarine could go on the surface. Revisit our earlier episodes about submarine warfare in World War II, where I talk about a submerged submarine is no better than a smart mine. He understood that completely. He understood that the only reason you submerge is for defensive purposes. When you want to be offensive, it's really important to, you know, be on the surface as much as you can, unless you're really trying to get in close, in which case defense is a great form of offense. But he understood fundamentally things that many submarine COs didn't. They weren't written in doctrine yet at this point in time. They were being discovered and evolved. And he was willing to take things like what Mush was doing on Wahoo, or what Dick O'Kane was doing, try them, improve them, evolve them, and develop those tactics. And in so doing, as we're going to talk about in a moment, he actually evolved the mission set of submarines in World War II. I would say that Mush Morton was really good at understanding how to fight a submarine and move the needle forward on how to offensively employ a submarine. Dick O'Kane, as we've said, was really good on how to find new operating areas and engage large numbers of targets simultaneously. Yeah, Gene's contribution to this expanding, arena of submarine warfare was finding new mission sets for submarines. And again, this becomes critical as the war progresses, and the number of targets that submarines can attack diminishes because they've sunk everything, essentially, right? So does that mean we give up? We can't use submarines anymore? No. He finds new and innovative ways to use those submarines.
Mm-hmm. He was incredible, and we're gonna get to the nuts and bolts. But I want to read one quote that he had. His upbeat personality and command traits were perfectly demonstrated in his often repeated motto, quote, "We don't have problems, we have solutions," unquote. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I never knew the man, but I've read enough about him to know if that doesn't summarize Gene Flucky, I don't know what does.
Yeah.
So
he had several other quotes too. I'm just struggling to remember another one that his crew picked up, but we also famously, his crew, as these events transpire that we're about to talk, his crew started referring to the Barb as Flucky's 8th Fleet. Right. But that's Flucky's 8th Fleet. And so we're about to describe why that whole notion, came to be.
Which embarrassed him to no end, either.
It did, yeah. But they prepared a flag that they flew from the bridge. It's Flucky's 8th Fleet. And it's just, it's wonderful when your crew takes to you that way.
Yeah, for sure. So Barb's 8th War Patrol is Gene Flucky's first War Patrol as commanding officer. They depart, Barb and Flucky and his crew depart midway bound for the Kurile Islands in the Sea of Okhotsk. Thank you.
Shorthand, we Pacific sailors shorthand to that name of that sea, from the Sea of Okhotsk to the Sea of O. So that's easier for you, Seth. You can call it the Sea of O.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I just completely got tongue-tied on that one right there. So point being, they're near the northern coast of Hokkaido in Japan. They're part of a wolf pack. And this is something, people hear wolf pack, they immediately think of U-boats, which is, appropriate. The United States Navy used wolf packs in the Pacific too, and they were modeled off of the German U-boat wolf packs for sure. Let's be
a little
clear
looser,
on that.
Right? But
for sure,
essentially,
for sure. But the same general idea. And this is the first submarine that we on this show have talked about that is operated as part of a wolf pack. Wahoo and Tang never did that. They were lone wolves. This particular wolf pack includes a USS Herring and the USS Growler. So it's a 3-boat wolf pack, and they are supposed to share any convoy sightings and coordinate wolf pack attacks on said sighted convoys with the wolf pack itself under the command of Gene Flucky, which is pretty impressive. This is this dude's first outing.
I think he might have already been a commander by now. He made commander.
I don't know,
during his tenure as CO, and he was certainly the senior of the 3 COs. But that might be why he was given command of the wolf pack.
Yeah, well, they're going out north and they're trying to rendezvous. Barb rendezvous with Herring near the ice floats in the Kurile Islands. And it's kind of weird if you think about it, the Pacific, you don't think of ice floats, but there are ice floats. Yeah,
absolutely. And they can wreak havoc on your periscopes, by the way. So it's not good to be submerged near ice floes if you can't see them. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, this is one of those times too, frankly. The two surface submarines exchange plans and lay out their patrol plans that will cover the area between the islands of Matsua and the La Perouse Straits. Now, the La Perouse Straits,
remember,
for those astute listeners will know, that's
right,
where
go
Mush
ahead,
and
Seth.
Wahoo went
You
down.
know what you're going to say.
Yeah, well, that's where
That's
Mush and
where,
Wahoo went down. Yeah.
And, Albacore went down there, and, it was a very dangerous place.
And as we're going to see here in just a minute, it's no less dangerous now than it was in October 1943. So they're trying to raise their third Wolfpack member, USS Growler, on the radio, and they're trying to send code to the Growler. They never do. They never are able to raise Growler. The Barb and the Herring then split the patrol area into two patrol areas. We later find out that Growler is actually sunk by, I believe it's Japanese destroyers. They kill her with depth charges, and that's why Barb and Herring are never able to raise Growler. So they kill Growler long before she ever even rendezvous with the rest of the Wolfpack to commence their attacks. Flucky and Herring skipper Dave Zabreski, they were actually friends. They were classmates, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Bill. I don't remember exactly,
so,
but yeah, and they divide their patrol up area into 10 square mile arenas, and basically say, we're going to look here, you look here, and then we'll get together and share information. Unfortunately, that's not exactly what happens, though, right?
Yeah, now the Wolfpack tactics aren't really, really sophisticated here, folks. This is just one of those deals where you know where each other are. And let's say there's a submarine to the east and a submarine to the west. The submarine that's to the west wants to attack whatever ships that enter their area from the west, thereby driving the fleeing ships to the east and into the hands of the submarine that's to the east. Frankly, it's no more complicated than that now. They're not going to be east-west, it's going to be a little bit more complicated, but you get the idea here.
But that's not what, to your exact point, that's not what happens here. They say they're going to share contacts, but they don't, frankly. Herring runs into a Japanese convoy, and the only reason that Barb ever knows that Herring runs into this Japanese convoy is because when Barb is submerged at one point, they hear depth charges going off, and they're like, well, they ain't depth charging us. So it has to be Herring.
Something's happening. Right.
Yeah, something going down. So late on the evening of May 31st, Barb contacts two Japanese ships on radar distance of 21,000 yards, which is pretty stretching out there for a submarine radar. Immediately, Flucky orders Barb to pursue the ships, bending 21 knots out of the sub in an effort to run the ships down. Now, previous skipper of Barb did not do that. He was one of those guys, kind of like Marvin Kennedy, that just waited for those ships to intersect Barb, whereas Flucky's like, we're going to go get them, and we're going to go get them right now. To your point, Bill, where he's walking around, he's leading by walking around the boat. After he gives order to open her up and let her run, he starts walking through the boat and basically just charging these guys up. Yeah.
Yep.
And when your skipper is going down through there, and you can attest to this, Bill, and you're going out to do your job, you're on the hunt. You're literally a dog chasing a rabbit, and you're going through the boat to the crew and pumping them up. That has got to bring the mood from here through the overhead instantly.
Yeah, absolutely. And when he goes stem to stern, he's in the after torpedo room, and he says, "Hey guys, we're going to go get them. Are you guys ready?" And they said, "Skipper, not only are we ready, we want you to fire stern tubes because we got all these torpedoes back here, and we don't have any bunk space." In those days, the torpedomen slept in the torpedo room. So did other people, by the way. We don't have any bunk space. So, boy, if we can get rid of some of these fish, we'd have more places to sleep. And he said, I'll tell you what, I promise you, we're going to empty a torpedo skid or two today if we can. So, and in fact, I think he said, we're going to fire the stern tubes first. Now, that's a little stretch, but I think he probably told them that.
Right. And again, that's just a perfect example of who the guy was. He listens to his crew. The crew frankly has the balls to say to the captain, "Hey, shoot back here first so we can sleep in a cot, so we can, not hot bunk it back here." And the skipper turns around and goes, "You know what? we're gonna take care of you guys. I'm gonna make sure that
Mhm.
happens. And again, just perfect example of just fine leadership right there. So the mood aboard Barb is electric because he's the one walking through the boat saying, "All right, guys, we're gonna go get him." And I mean, he said in his book that you could literally feel the energy of the crew as
Mhm.
they're chasing these Japanese ships down. Um, as Barb nears the reported radar contact, Gene flies through the galley, grabs a cup of hot soup and a sandwich, stuffs the sandwich in his parka because remember it's cold, goes up topside,
Mhm.
wolfs down the cup of soup and stuffs the sandwich in his mouth as they're tracking down this Japanese convoy. The weather topside is absolutely atrocious. Bill, you've sailed the North Pacific. That is not good weather, is it?
Well, and again, if you don't mind my segue into a 1980s submarine story, the most miserable off the deck watch I ever had. We were on the surface, coming out of Yokosuka, Japan, and we were traveling through what's called Sagami-Wan, the Bay of Sagami. And in those days, we had towed array sonar, but you would have to attach it topside before you could submerge. And it was too rough and too cold for the tugboat that had our towed array to come out to meet us. So we had to stay surfaced. We couldn't submerge until we attached this towed array silver. So I spent the mid-watch of midnight to 6 a.m. on the bridge with green water over the bridge, soaking wet in 30-degree weather. And I put my wetsuit on, and it didn't do any good at all. So it sucks when it's cold and wet on the bridge of a submarine because it's only 15, 20 feet off of the ocean surface, right? And if the seas are high, you're taking green water over the bridge, you're cold and wet, and no amount of, and if you push hot coffee, right, what happens after you drink a lot of hot coffee or any other liquid. And so,
Right.
it's miserable. And so, and then you got people shooting at you at the same time. It was bad enough when nobody was shooting at me. Let me just say that.
Well, they do get shot at right here, as a matter of fact. And the weather, to your point, was piss poor, to say the least. The seas were rough, yet still a Japanese airplane is airborne and spots Barb. Immediately, one of the lookouts sees this Japanese aircraft coming into Barb. Flucky clears the bridge, boom, brings her down. Japanese drop bombs on Barb, obviously miss her. But just as she's really starting to get you'll hear the phrase again later, bone in her teeth as much as a submarine can, she's got to plunk on down underneath the waves to avoid this Japanese aircraft. Flucky assumes correctly that Herring is the one that's under depth charge attack. And in fact, Herring is under depth charge attack because she is attacking the convoy. She sinks. Herring attacks the escort Ishigaki and the Hokyo Maru, one of the Japanese merchantmen that are within this convoy. And it is assumed at this point that Herring loses radio, that either she loses her radio specifically, like it just goes on the fritz, or that she loses her antenna or something happens to her, because she does not contact Barb at all following this particular instance. Now, she's not sunk yet. I'm just spoiler alert, Herring does go down, but this is not the moment that she does. So what Herring does do in this attack, instead of radioing Barb and saying, hey, here's the convoy, her attack scatters this convoy, doesn't it, Bill?
Yeah, it does. And like I said before, it effectively gets done what the wolf pack is supposed to try to get done. You conduct a successful attack. Hopefully you sink a couple of ships. The other ones kind of understand the direction that the attack came from and run in the other direction. And if you've set it up properly, then when the ships run away, they're running into your wolf pack partner's operating area, which is what happens here.
Mm-hmm. Later on that day, Barb hears what they deem to be shore guns firing. At this point, Flucky and no contact is heard from Herring again. At this point, Flucky assumes that Herring is under attack and probably sunk. She is. She's lost with all hands on June 1st, 1944. Her wreck is actually discovered in 2016. USS Herring was found in 2016. Back to Barb. In a short amount of time, the targets that Barb had been tracking come into physical view. They actually can see them now, and they are indeed scattered remnants of this convoy. Through the scope, Gene sees Japanese sailors. They're close enough where he can physically see people looking into the water,
Water.
watching for torpedoes, right? Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
So,
You know, he said, he writes in his book about this incident. You know, he feels bad for the sailors in the water, but he said, so sorry, we did not start this war in his book.
Mhm.
And so he just moves on and fires his spread of torpedoes. I think 2 fish hit a merchantman called Madras Maru, leaving her dead in the water and sinking. And as that ship goes down, Barb picks up another ship on radar and starts chasing that one, also a merchant called Kodomaru. It provides an easy chase for Barb. Kodomaru turns out to be slower than Barb was on the surface, and Barb catches her rather quickly.
So keeping his word, what does Gene Flucky do though here, which is I find to be very admirable of the man.
This is kind of awkward because you're chasing a ship, you kind of close it, but you're not. In order to do what he promised to do, he's got to overrun the firing point so he could turn around, because then he's going to start opening, unless he backs down, which he's not going to do. Then he's going to start opening the ship so he could use the stern tubes. So, he does that. He overruns the firing point, flips around, reverses course, and then brings his stern tubes to bear. And remember, the target bearing transmitter, or TBT, is on the forward part of the bridge. And so now he's aiming his torpedoes to the stern, which is kind of clumsy. It's actually easier to use the periscope to target ships astern of you than it is the TBT. So there's a bunch of different choreography that needs to happen to conduct this on the surface attack using the stern tubes.
So it's not an easy feat, is what you're saying. In other words, so again, that goes to the point of A, he kept his word to his crew. B, his crewmen are fully aware that it's not something you can just shoot the torpedoes at the stern and it's a done deal. It's an orchestrated ballet.
Go the other way. No, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. So the crew, at least the after torpedo room crew, realizes that he's doing what he said he was going to do, and he's going that extra mile just to make sure that his crew's happy, and that had to sit well. So needless to say, Barb does sink both of her targets. She sinks 2 ships in 3 hours on the first patrol of Barb under the command of Eugene Flucky. He decided on his own volition that he needed a prisoner, because he was keenly aware that this area that they were patrolling in was theoretically heavily mined. It was a heavily mined area at this point. The loss of Wahoo was known, or at least it was assumed, and it was assumed that she was lost in this general vicinity at that time by a mine. And of course, we know now it wasn't, but at that time they assumed that it was a mine that took her out. So to that end, Flucky decides that he needs to get himself a prisoner who would know the area, know, hopefully, the mine layout of the area. And that's exactly what he does, doesn't he, Bill? They go out there to go find a Japanese prisoner, and he goes and gets one.
Let me provide some context here. If you sunk a warship, let's say you sunk a cruiser with 1,200 sailors on it, and you go back to the site of that sinking, and you're going to pluck out one sailor to try to get some idea where the minefields are, you got like a 1 in 100 chance of plucking out a sailor that knows anything about the minefield, because that cruiser will have enginemen, boiler technicians, gunners' mates. They'll have no idea where the mines are. But this is a merchant ship. Merchant ships have much smaller crews. And many, let's say a third of the merchant ship's crew will be bridge crew. And so your chance of plucking out somebody who knows something about the minefields improves to 1 in 3 rather than 1 in 100. And so it's not as outlandish as you might think. This notion that he's going to go back to the thing, grab a guy, and that guy might know something about the minefields, because that's exactly what happens. He fishes out a guy named Kirojima Sanji, and Kido, for short, as he's called by the crew, is able to direct Barb through the minefield. He does know about it, and even acts as a torpedo man on board Barb, helping to load torpedoes in the forward torpedo room to help sink ships of his own country. Man, oh man, that is something that is unimaginable, never portrayed in movies, as far as I can tell.
But it's true. It's a true, and it's not the only time in the war that he does this kind of thing. It's not the only time in Barb's life, that prisoners are captured and then they act as part of the crew. So I mean, it's you think it's like, what? No, that's written in a movie. That's not true. No, that's 100% true. This guy became almost an adopted member of the crew. And to your point, yeah, acted as a torpedo man and helped load torpedoes in the forward torpedo room. Like, he wasn't pressed into service. He volunteered to do it. So there's even pictures of him.
Kind of tells you what he thought of the war, huh?
Yeah, really. Well, I mean, he just got sunk. So he probably about had enough. But often, and this is the first time that this occurs, is that, after Barb sinks a ship or several ships or what have you, any attack that concludes successfully, Gene orders a cake to be baked for distribution among the crew. And as you said earlier, splice the main brace. At this point, they're drinking whiskey. Later on, they wind up shifting to beer because the whiskey apparently was, horse piss. But regardless of that, he orders a cake to be baked. And there is a picture, and I'll have to see if I can find it for the video. There is a picture of Kito, this Japanese, smiling, all teeth and smiles, behind the cake that celebrates the sinking of his ship. And he gets a piece of this cake. Flucky ordered, it's like, give the guy a piece of the cake. Hell of a man.
Kafkaesque, a theater of the absurd moment here that we're talking about. But again, his men loved him for small acts like this. Even rock gut whiskey, they liked them for. Yeah.
So the remainder of this patrol goes very well, actually, for that matter. Barb sinks an additional 3 ships plus 2 fishing boats, bringing her war patrol total to 5 enemy ships for an estimated 15,472 tons. Gene's first patrol as CEO of Barb is one of the most successful in the history of the war so far. So any doubts that... Go ahead.
No, what I was going to say, sorry to interrupt, is that people have a tendency to think that some CEOs were luckier than others in as much as they encountered target ships. If every submarine had one good war patrol, you could blame that on chance, luck of the draw, happened to be in the right place at the right time when the targets appeared. But what we learn time after time is that the same CEOs find themselves in places where there's an accumulation of targets. And once you understand that, then you understand that it's not luck. It's they drove their ships into a position where they were able to do what they needed to do, whereas other CEOs didn't. That's intentional, and it's due to skill, talent, aggressiveness. And so that's why we speak as much about the CEOs as we do about the ships in these episodes.
Yeah, because of all Navy ships, it's the CEOs of these submarines that really, and destroyers too, to a point, but specifically submarines, because more often than not, they're by themselves. It's the CEOs that drive the aggressive behavior of these submarines. And this is a perfect example of that. This is a perfect example. So she goes back to, I believe she goes back to Pearl after this. And, Charlie Lockwood, Admiral Lockwood, is enthusiastic, to say the least, over Flucky's performance. Not that there was any doubt that he wouldn't perform well as a CEO, but I don't think anybody expected him to do this, because at the beginning, or right before they went out on patrol, Gene Flucky tells Admiral Lockwood, or he asks Admiral Lockwood, he says, "How many ships do you want me to sink, Admiral Lockwood?" And Lockwood just picks a number out of thin air. He goes, "I don't know, 5. And Flucky says, "Okay, I'll get you 5." And he got him 5. And he comes back and he tells Admiral Lockwood, he says, "I got you your 5. I told you I'd get you 5.
You should have asked for more.
Yeah, really. Remarkable guy. Just remarkable. So Barb's 9th War Patrol, Bill. It's for this patrol, Barb is again assigned to a wolf pack. And this is a recurring theme. She more often than not does work as part of a wolf pack, which is cool, because it's, to your point earlier when you were saying that a lot of it was loosey-goosey, especially on her first patrol under Flucky. It's very true. But those tactics, I think, for the U.S., were being sharpened, honed, if you will, throughout the war. And as you'll see throughout these recurring patrols, when she's part of a wolf pack, they do coordinate their attacks better. They do communicate better. They do what you just said, chase the other ships into the net, if you will. So the tactics do evolve, and Barb is part of this. She's all part of all of this. This wolf pack consists of USS Tunney and the Queenfish, and of course Barb. The trio was assigned to patrol the area near Manila and Hong Kong sea lanes. It's known to be a, quote, hot area with hunter-killer groups located and aircraft out the yin-yang that are out there looking for submarines to kill. So this is an area in which these boats are actively being hunted, which you would think they would be hunted more on the Japanese coast, but they weren't. They were actively hunted in this area because the Japanese were eventually, at this point, building up defenses for the invasion of the Philippines that they knew was eventually coming.
Yeah, and remember that this area here, you go from the Straits of Malacca near Singapore to Hong Kong to the Philippines. Those are the lines of communication to bring all these raw materials into Japan that Japan needed to fight the war. So they were prime hunting areas for the submarines, because there was a lot of merchant traffic through that passage. And even you'll remember from our talk about decoy, the Taiwan Strait, which was called the Strait of Formosa back then, where ships would go west of Formosa to try to get away from the submarines to get up to Japan. But there was a lot of traffic, vital traffic for the Japanese for oil, raw materials, rubber, things like that.
This is the lifeblood, if you will, at this point in the war for the Japanese. At this point in the war, and we've talked about this a lot too, that the Japanese didn't have radar. In 1942, they really didn't. They kind of rudimentary, but in 1944, they do have radar. It's not on par with 1944 era US radar, but it is radar, and not every ship has it. But a lot of these hunter-killer groups, there's at least one ship that does, and this is no different. So in this area specifically, United States Navy submarines are going to encounter more often than not Japanese ships that do have radar. So if you can see them, more than likely they can see you as well. And this is what happens throughout this patrol. Flucky in his book talks about getting sick of being a yo-yo, because they're constantly going up and down, up and down, up and down. Because every time they go up to surface to scout, to hunt, they're driven under by either a Japanese ship that's clearly wielding radar or aircraft. So it's just this constant up, down, up, down, up, down all the way through. And it's infuriating Gene Flucky, because he can't do what he wants to do, which is to get on the surface and just run at breakneck speed, find these ships and sink them. To that end, on August 30th, Barb, in concert with Queenfish and Tunney, receive an ultra message. And we've talked about ultra before, Bill, but this played a huge role in the success of U.S. submarines in the Pacific. Ultra was feeding a lot of this information to the subs, weren't they? Or wasn't it?
Yeah, ultra's a shorthand word for communications intelligence. It means we broke Japanese code to do something. And so, yeah, the ultra messages were being fed to all the submarines in the area, as far as, there's a Japanese convoy reporting in their location here. So they would route them there. A lot of times, though, these ultra messages were time late, and by the time you got to the area where the convoy was reported to be, they'd be gone. So they were better than not having them, but it didn't give you 100% guarantee of success.
It did at one point, though, and this particular message, it tells the trio, we'll just call it the trio, it tells the trio that there is theoretically a somewhat large Japanese convoy expected to be in there or passing through their patrol area in the near future. So in other words, keep your eyes peeled. The three subs are working together with another wolf pack. So there's actually two American wolf packs in this area. They're forcing the convoy slowly and steadily. These two wolf packs are forcing this convoy into a smaller and smaller area. This initial wolf pack, which I frankly forget the name of the wolf pack, makes the initial contact and attacks, and they're kind of feeding them, like you were saying, Bill, to Barb's Wolfpack area and Queenfish and Tunny and all these boats down here. Queenfish leads the attacking group, first firing and scoring on 2 tankers. At 0624, an hour after sighting 6 ships in the convoy, the enemy was drawing nearer and nearer and nearer. As Barb was prepping for her attack, Flucky noticed that the lead Japanese escort, a mine layer, ran up signal flags. Probably not doing that on accident, are they?
It's not a random course change, that's for sure.
Right.
Especially from a mine layer. The course changes are going to be the signal from the command ship.
Right. What the mine layer was trying to do was tell the rest of the convoy that there is a submarine in the area and we can see it. It was not the Barb. It was Queenfish that the mine layer was seeing, that was on the surface along with Tunny and Barb. But nevertheless, their cloak of invisibility is broken, and the Japanese know that the submarines are in the area. Seconds later, well, after let me get back. After they're raising their signal flags, Flucky realizes that this is, the jig is up. So he plunks her down. He puts Barb underneath the water, and decides to make a submerged approach on the convoy. After he gets underneath the water, his sound man, Barb's sound man, hears the sound of incoming torpedoes. Now, Bill, most of us have seen The Hunt for Red October, and there's, we know that Admiral Fargo was a part of that. And there's a scene in the movie, several scenes, where you hear the incoming whine of torpedoes. I have never been under the water in a submarine, and I'm damn sure I've never heard torpedoes fire at me. I don't know if you have, but that has got to be the ultimate pucker moment as a submariner when you hear incoming fish.
I can neither confirm nor deny. However, I can tell you that torpedoes are loud and they're easy to hear. And yeah, when you hear those words coming out of a sonar operator or sound man's mouth, torpedo in the water, it gets your attention. Now, a better movie example of this would be Run Silent, Run Deep, because remember, in that movie, several submarines are sunk by torpedoes in the Bungo Strait. And so that becomes a major issue in that movie. And it turns out that those torpedoes, I hate to be a spoiler, but those torpedoes are fired by other Japanese submarines, not by surface ships or destroyers. So in this case, you've got torpedo in the water. They probably didn't have the ability to determine just by sound, by listening to them, because there was no real frequency analysis of the acoustic data in those days, that these torpedoes were Mark 14 torpedoes fired by a U.S. ship. But they probably figured it out because of the bearing that the torpedoes were coming from, that these were friendly torpedoes. If there is such a thing, fired at you, if it's fired at you, it ain't friendly, let me tell you that. So this was a pucker moment. The way you described it is exactly right.
And that's to your point, that is exactly what they were. They were friendly torpedoes. We don't know if it was Queenfish or Tunny or whomever, but the U.S. submarines were operating so close together, and they were all attacking this convoy at once. It's kind of like a pack of dogs attacking something, or a pack of wolves. I mean, a wolf pack, but attacking, a bison or whatever. They're all biting at the same target from different angles, and sooner or later, if you're not careful, one of the other wolves is going to get bit if you're not careful. And that's almost what happens here. In the distance, Barb hears several torpedoes explode on target simultaneously, while she hears the whine of the incoming torpedoes pass directly overhead. Now, she was deep enough where the torpedoes weren't going to hit her.
An important point here, because you know that these torpedoes weren't, first of all, they weren't homing torpedoes, and secondly, they're not going to seek you in depth. So you hear them come in, they're probably going to be running at, let's just say, 10 feet. It's easy to get beneath them. So it's not like, modern days Hunt for Red October, where the torpedoes will home you in depth. That wasn't the case. All he needed to do was go to 200 feet, 250 feet, give him a little bit of margin in depth. And he's not going to get hit. So it's not that much of a crisis from that standpoint.
Right. When he hears them go overhead, it's not just one. He hears a whole passel of them go overhead. And he has a remark that I found to be rather humorous. He says, quote, in his book, he says, quote, that must have been Eli and Sea Lion. He always shoots a nestful and with success. Of course, he's referring to Eli Reich, and who was another successful submariner. It was a classmate of his. Now, at this point, after the torpedoes pass over top of him, Flucky gets up to scope depth and pops his scope up there, sights in on the largest target in the center column, 750 yards away. Setting his fish for a spread, he actually aims at two ships. By the way. Yeah, that's close. Yeah, he sets his spread to hit two ships. Now, this is not uncommon where the ships are actually overlapping one another because they're so close together, right?
Yeah, it's hard to miss when you're going to hit something. You don't need to be very precise. You just need to get them out toward the aim point. Remember, we talked about that repeatedly.
As right after he fires the fish, he turns around and he tells one of the chief of the boat, who's a gentleman named Swish Saunders, they called him. He tells him, get 4 cases of beer in the cooler. We'll be drinking them, or we'll be splicing the main brace soon enough. Soon after he orders our torpedoes to be fired. So he's rather confident. 6 fish leave Barb, smacking the large target, which turned out to be the tanker Rico Maru. Also hitting the overlapping target, which is a cargo ship called the Okuni Maru as well at the same time. Kuni Maru goes down with most of her crew, but the Rico Maru only speeds. She speeds off as much as she can, while Barb is held down by a flock of aircraft and the escorts. The Okuni Maru actually survives for quite a while. She gets beached. The skipper beaches her and she becomes a target for aircraft. And even though Barb is the one that, and this is kind of one of those targets or one of those sinkings that probably should be credited to Barb, but isn't, because she doesn't actually force her down, but it's her damage that causes the ship to beach. Well, if the ship is beached, it's just as much. Yeah. I mean, it's almost the same, right?
Yeah, it's a mission kill. And so you don't get credit for the sinking, but it's good. Yeah.
So the Japanese are keenly aware that the convoy, which is designated as MI-15, by the way, is under a Wolfpack attack. They decide to deploy this hunter-killer group that we had talked about before. And this is important because these guys show up repeatedly to track down these submarines in this area and kill them. Barb, at this point, is tracking what she thinks is a small freighter. But the vessel is actually it's called the Hinode Maru number 20. And it's a converted auxiliary minesweeper that was being used as a decoy for the hunter-killer group. So, Bill, we talked about Japanese ASW procedures earlier in Wahoo and Tang and stuff like that, but they have progressed significantly at this point to not only have a hunter-killer group, but a decoy with that hunter-killer group that they're willing to use as sacrificial lamb.
If I refer you to Run Silent, Run Deep, where you have these Q ships or quail ships that look like they draw a significant draft, and so you fire the torpedo, but the draft is actually much shallower, the keel is actually much shallower, and the torpedoes end up running underneath them. But then you've exposed yourself with your torpedo attack, and they come in and kill you. Common tactic at this point in the war.
Yeah, but that just goes to show you the advancement that the Japanese, they realized the threat that the pig boats were posing to their lifeblood, and they decided they had to do whatever they had to do to kill these guys, even if it meant potentially sacrificing some of their own men and ships to get that done. This is another comical episode, if you will, in the life of USS Barb and Gene Flucky. Flucky has no idea that this thing is a decoy. He just sees a ship and he's like, well, we're going to sink this thing. He pops up his scope and something is obscuring his scope.
You can't see the ship.
Yeah, and he plunks it down and pops it up and plunks it down and pops it up, and something's on the scope. Bill, what is going on here?
Yeah, in submarine language, we call it a B1RD, a bird. And so sometimes the bird will sit on your periscope and you lower it and the bird flies away, you raise it, bird comes back, you lower it, flies away, raise it, comes back. And then periscopes that day where the head window is very near the top of the scope, where, nowadays you've got an antenna above the head window, so it's a little lower. That would provide that B1RD would provide a substantial visual obstruction. But of course, you got 2 scopes. So the solution is to raise the other one.
And that's exactly what he does here. And there is a picture, and I will show it, of the bird literally sitting right there on top of the damn periscope. Undaunted, with or without the B1RD, Flucky launches his fish and does sink this decoy ship. And it has the prescribed effect, shall we say, that once this ship goes down, it's a wooden ship, by the way. It flings bodies through the air as the torpedoes explode on her. And immediately the hunter-killer group decides they can see where these torpedoes had come from. They are tracking Barb down, and they hold her down for a while. They drop, I don't know how many depth charges, I don't recall, but they depth charged the bejesus out of her.
Like 40 or 50 depth charges. And of course, you're trying to creep away at minimum speed so you don't make noise, so they can't track you. Like you got 360 degrees in the compass, pick one. Try to figure out which course is going to get you out of there quickly. And so it's essentially what they've done.
In these Japanese infested waters, destroyers, minesweepers, whatever, aircraft, the couple days later, Barb takes actually physical damage from Japanese bombs. She's again on the surface. She again dives to avoid the aircraft, but the aircraft are aggressive. They drop bombs and they do hit Barb. And I say hit, they don't actually penetrate Barb, but they do enough. They get close enough where they do damage. They break off her radio antenna. They rupture some lines internally. And it's probably damage that's probably significant enough that he very easily could have said, you know what, guys, that's enough. We're out of here. Let's go back to Pearl or Midway or wherever and go get this fixed. But he doesn't do that, does he?
No, he doesn't. It's just not in his nature to do that. I still have torpedoes. I still have weapons. I still have periscopes. Didn't damage that. Don't need the radio. What do we need to talk for? So let's keep going.
Yeah. And he, in his book, he wrote, and you got to kind of wonder if it was, post-war him remembering that I felt that something big was in the works, or if he actually did. Regardless of this, he says in his book that he felt that something big was in the works. Like they were going to run into something big here very, very soon. That was the one reason that he didn't want to turn around. Actually, we had captured Saipan by this point. Saipan was a rest stop and a repair area for subs. That he didn't go to Saipan and have his boat repaired there. He just said, "The hell with it. We're going to continue this mission." It's very lucky that he does so. On September 16th, 1944, Barb receives a message instructing her to proceed to the area in which several Japanese cargo ships were sunk just days prior by Sea Lion. This is Eli Reich's boat that we just talked about a little while ago.
Just forgive me for this, Seth, but remind me, has the Marianas Turkey shoot happened at this point yet? It has.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. This is September 16th. This is around the invasion of Peleliu. So this is long after Phil C. Yeah, this is three months or so after Phil C. Okay. But Barb was told that Japanese cargo ships had been sunk by Sea. Well, they didn't say Sea Lion, but it was Sea Lion. That Japanese cargo ships had been sunk in this area, and that it had become known after the sinking that several Japanese ships that were sunk were carrying Allied prisoners of war. And that there may be the possibility that some of these Allied POWs may be floating in the area among the wreckage of these ships. So Barb is instructed to proceed to Barb and her and Queenfish are instructed to proceed to this area to search for the possibility of rescuing Allied prisoners of war that may or may not be floating in the water. One of the ships particular that had been carrying prisoners of war was the Rakio Maru. It had been sunk on September 12th, so 4 days earlier, by Sea Lion. And it was not known at the time that the ship was carrying prisoners of war. The Japanese never marked their ships that were carrying prisoners of war. They were a firm believer that the Red Cross was nothing but a target. So they did not mark anything with a Red Cross. Pompanito, USS Pompanito, which, by the way, is in San Francisco Bay as a memorial, great boat, go visit her, was part of a different wolf pack, was cruising the area of the sinking on the surface when she encountered some of these floating survivors. This is how this information got back to ComSub Pack, is that Pompanito is on the surface. She sees human beings in the water, assuming them to be Japanese.
They've been in the water for 4 or 5 days, right?
Yeah. These guys, they're already in horrible shape. Now they're in really bad shape.
Similar to USS Indianapolis at this point, less than USS Juneau, which was 10 days.
Right. But and these guys are POWs anyway, so they're on death's door as it was before they even get on the damn boat.
That's right.
Yeah. So immediately reporting what they find, they assume Pompanito assumes that these people in the water are Japanese, so they approach them, weapons drawn, ready to rock and roll, and they hear English coming out of these mouths of these people. And remember, these guys are covered in black oil, so you can't tell if they're white men or not until you get them aboard. They get them aboard and they realize, oh, my God, these are British, these are Dutch, these are Australians, mostly Aussies. And they immediately send us back to ComSub back. And that's how Barb and Flucky get this message to go out there and go look and see what you can find. As I was saying, Barb and Queenfish are diverted from their assigned patrol area and make flank speed to the assigned waters. On the way, the weather begins to grow worse. And this is a harrowing thing, but it's all part of the story of Gene, Flucky, and Barb right here. The weather starts to go worse, grow worse. Why? Because they're in a typhoon, or at least they're on the outer fringes of a typhoon.
Yeah, it's coming. The barometer's dropping like a rock. It's a very easy indicator that huge storm on the way.
Bill, I've lived in South Louisiana. I've been through many a hurricane, but I've never been at sea in a typhoon. Have you ever been at sea in a typhoon?
Twice. I hate to say it, but once on the surface.
Oh my God.
So, submarines have main ballast tank vent covers, basically plates you put over the main ballast tank vents when you're in port, so you don't submerge accidentally by opening the main ballast tank vents. And one time couldn't get the vent covers off the aft main ballast tank vents because the weather got rough really fast, and so couldn't submerge. So ran through a typhoon on the surface once. It sucked. Round-hulled ship rolls a lot. I would not recommend it. Second time was at 600 feet, and we were rolling at 600 feet. This is several years later. So that typhoon affects water pretty deep, and I don't think Barb would have run at 600 feet. So, and at this point, where they're trying to rescue Allied prisoners of war on the surface, of course, they're on the surface as this typhoon approaches.
Right. But as the typhoon is approaching, and you remember it's Queenfish and Barb, and Queenfish is well ahead of Barb. Queenfish sights a convoy and radios the report to Barb. Now, they're still on their way to go, hopefully, rescue prisoners of war, but, they're also there to fight a war. So if they're going to run into a convoy, they're going to attack it. And that's exactly what happens here. About an hour after Queenfish radios the contact, Barb also sees this convoy. Convoy was a large one. It was heavily escorted by several destroyers, and destroyer escorts are their version of a frigate thereof, and subchasers. So this is an important convoy, very clearly. It's very heavily escorted. There's a lot of warships surrounding this thing. As Barb neared the convoy, she noticed Flucky could make out a large target, a tanker that was squat in the middle of the convoy surrounded by escorts, clearly an important target. At 11,700 tons. That's a big tanker for World War II, right, Bill?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, not by today's standards, but all ships were, smaller back then.
Yeah, she was riding low in the water, and I've asked you about this before, but some viewers might not recall. You can tell pretty easily, can't you, Bill, if they're full or not?
You can. The water line will sit really high out of the water if the tanker is empty. If the tanker is full, you won't see all of that hull fouling from sea growth because the ship's riding deeper. And so that's a great sign that this tanker's, you're going to sink her either way because she's a valuable target either way. But if you sink her and, deny the Japanese Navy of thousands of gallons of oil in the process, even better.
And then she's a juicy target, to say the least. As Barb is roaring into the convoy, now this is tactics a la Dick O'Kane, where he's going to get inside the convoy and shoot them up inside the convoy on the surface. A lookout topside screams down to Gene Flucky, quote, "That big ship between the columns is an aircraft carrier," unquote. Needless to say, that got Flucky's attention real quick. this is not a common occurrence that an aircraft carrier
No.
is actually being used to escort a convoy. And in this case, it is.
Yeah. I think Sam Dealey sunk an aircraft carrier. It was very uncommon for a submarine. There were opportunities early in the war for submarines to sink aircraft carriers when the torpedoes didn't work. And so, only a couple of successful submarine sinking aircraft carrier events throughout the war.
Yep. And this is going to be one of them. As Barb approaches a firing position, a lookout, I don't know who it was, one of the lookouts on Barb cites one of the escorts coming with, quote, a bone in her teeth, unquote. Now, Bill, to those who are not sailors, what does that mean?
I mean, she knows we're here and she's getting ready to attack us, and she's coming, flank speed right at us. It's a bad sign.
Yeah. It's another one of those pucker moments, shall we say. As undeterred, Gene Flucky says, we'll deal with that later. I've got an aircraft carrier, an 11,700 ton tanker in my view. I'm going to sink these ships come hell or high water. He opens up Barb up to flank speed through the storm, by the way. And about 10 minutes later, Barb is in firing position with the escort closing in on her in choppy seas. He fires his first fish. Gene noticed that the escort at this point, the escort is coming into ram. Clearing the bridge, Barb dives, firing as she dives down. As she's going down, he's popping them out as he's going down, emptying all 6 forward tubes on the way down. 2 minutes after firing and diving, explosions are heard. A second explosion clearly on the tanker caused such a concussion that the submerged Barb bounced around under the water. Now, Bill, this goes back to your point about the typhoon pushing you around 600 feet.
You got to be close for it to cause you to roll, rock and roll. You're going to hear those explosions from a long way away. Sure. But for them to cause you to shake the ship with like a depth charge would, you've got to be close to where these explosions occurred.
Mm-hmm. And just seconds later, after what is presumed to be the tanker explodes, Flucky hears boom, boom, boom. 3 torpedoes hit what he assumes to be the aircraft carrier. Post-war records indicate that the aircraft carrier fought to stay, and the aircraft carrier, by the way, is the Unyo. It was a smaller Japanese aircraft carrier, but it was a flat top all the same. And as we all know, that flat tops were the primary ships in the Pacific War, just a shade above submarines. And post-war records show that the aircraft carrier fought to stay afloat for several hours. And her crew did try to save her and almost did. They almost did save her. But despite their best efforts, she does indeed sink by the stern. And it's several months later when Barb gets confirmation of this sinking. But they do indeed sink this aircraft carrier, which is the Unyo, a Japanese aircraft carrier, Unyo. Now, Bill, what happens next? This is a very thrilling attack in that he sinks an 11,000-ton tanker and a friggin' carrier, but that's not actually what he was assigned to do at this point. He's assigned to go find, hopefully, Allied lives. What does he do after this? What goes on?
He does go back to the area to search for the prisoners of war, and he searched for hours, and the seas are still rough. I remember the typhoon may be on the way. She actually was able to locate and rescue 14 Allied prisoners of war, mostly Australians and Brits. And, they would have certainly died if they hadn't encountered them and picked them up. And, years later, Gene Flucky would say he was proud of 2 things in his submarine career. Number 1, rescuing those 14 prisoners of war. And number 2, the fact that not single member of his crew ever received a Purple Heart. So those 2 things. So this was the first one of those 2 things. He didn't know yet that the second one would come true, but he was very proud of this.
Yeah, and in his book again, he says, seeing the physical state of these people, and once they realized the prisoners of war, once the prisoners of war realized that it was Americans that were rescuing them, fishing them out of the water, once he saw these people and they communicated to him as best they could, because these guys were on the verge of death, and just profusely thanked him, being the captain, for ordering his ship to pluck them out of the water. It was one of the few instances in his career, he said, where he actually started to well up. He started to tear up because he he was just struck by what he saw and what was going on around him. Two ships of this convoy were carrying prisoners of war. Just to lay it on the lines, give everybody the facts here. The Kachadoki Maru and the Rakio Maru, which we were talking about earlier, were carrying prisoners of war, and both of these ships were sunk. Pompanito sank Kachadoki, which held 950 prisoners of war, and Sea Lion sank Rakio Maru, which held 1,317 prisoners of war. The Japanese rescued 520 POWs from the Kachadoki, but 431 died in the sinking. 1,150 from Rakio Maru were lost, and a further 350 were murdered when the Japanese machine gunned the lifeboats the POWs were in. So, not to get on our soapbox here, but I just have to say, we talked about Bill, you and I talked about, Mush Morton machine gunning the people in the water that actually turned out to be Indian POWs. John Parshall and I talked about, Japanese machine gunning aviators at the Bismarck Sea, and we doing the same in Bismarck Sea. And it's a thing that goes on and on and on throughout the war. But, if you ever wondered why these instances were carried out, here's an example. Prisoners of war who are already on their death bed that have been horribly mistreated by the Japanese are machine gunned in the water because they just don't feel like fishing them out. So
picking them up. Yep.
Yeah. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Barb's next patrol, which is her 10th, was also successful when she sank a further 3 ships. Now, we're going to glance over that because we're going to get to the really adventurous stuff here in just a second.
So, this is the legend.
Yeah, well, these next 2 patrols are
a single legendary patrol in all of World War II. If you had to pick one to say this is it's the exemplar for all submariners, this is the one.
This is it. She leaves Pearl Harbor on December 20th, 1944. She's again part of a wolf pack with Queenfish and now Pakuta. Tunney had gotten damaged and she was out of this particular rotation of boats here. Now Pakuta is part of the wolf pack, and the 3 of them are going to be operating off the China coast and the Formosa Straits. This is the same area that Dick O'Kane and USS Tang were lost in. Over the next several weeks, Barb encounters Japanese shipping in dribs and drabs. She's sinking ships, but it's not in like these, big passels that she's not encountering large convoys is basically the gist of it. Only once did she encounter a convoy, and when she did, she scored sinking 2 ships on January 8th, 1945. Later that night, Barb attacked the same convoy 2 more times, getting an estimated additional 4 ships, although it's not confirmed. As I said, records are not clear who sank what, but as Barb was operating as part of the wolf pack, all the subs attacked this convoy at the same time, so nobody knows who the hell sank what. But that's not the really important part of this patrol. For the next several weeks, he's not running into shipping, is he, Bill? I mean, they're patrolling the China coast and they're not finding anything.
Maybe this is a good time to talk about something we've never talked about before, Seth. The fact that we had coast watchers in China. We talked a lot about coast watchers in the Solomons Island campaign, on New Georgia, Bougainville, places like that. And so when most of those coast watchers were Australian, New Zealanders, things like that. We also had coast watchers in China that were under the command of a command that I think is called Commander China Group, something like that. Do you remember? I don't remember what the name.
I don't recall.
Yeah, it was the U.S. Naval Group China, Nav Group China. That's what it was. But these were mostly sailors and Marines, enlisted sailors and Marines, and they were making contact reports about convoys traveling up and down the coast of China. And so, for several weeks, contract reports are being made. But the problem was the water was shallow. You couldn't run at flank speed. You couldn't do, and it was mined, you couldn't do many of the things you needed to do to get where the contact report occurred before the contact was lost, right? The data was lost. So Flucky was running up and down the coast in reaction to a lot of these coast watcher reports and oftentimes finding nothing. And there's an old saying that, death has 1,000 fathers, but failure is an orphan. I mean, success has 1,000 fathers, but failure is an orphan, right? And there's examples here because Flucky is going to find some success on the China coast. In fact, he becomes known as the galloping ghost of the China coast. And when he finds that success, all kinds of people are going to want to take credit for directing Barb to these locations where they found that success. And a lot of post-war analysis went into determining if there was actually any reports, any ultra reports or Coast Watcher reports that contributed to Barb being where they needed to be to find these convoys. And all the post-war analysis proves that what Gene Flucky said in his book, which was they were just distractions, was true. That he found all these targets and sunk all these targets pretty much on his own.
That's exactly right. He had deduced from the lack of shipping that they were running into, he had deduced that the Japanese convoys, which he knew were there, to your point, the Coast Watchers were seeing them and reporting them, but they weren't, the subs couldn't find the damn things to sink them. He had deduced that they were hugging the coast. And by hugging the coast, I mean hugging the coast, like they are within sight of shore.
Dredged areas. Yeah, their channels were being created for them to run up and down.
And that is exactly what was happening. They were actually dredging parts of channels and in areas in between islands so that these convoys could run to avoid the submarines. That's how much the submarines were affecting the Japanese war effort at this point in 1945, is that the Japanese were like scrambling to try and get shipping to Japan, and they were doing whatever the hell they could to get it done because they were so scared of the American submarines. He believed, as I was saying, that they were hugging the coast and that they were probably putting into Chinese ports at night, because it was also a known thing that American submarines like to attack at night. So the Japanese were putting into these ports at night and just kind of holding up, and then they were sailing during the day when they'd have aircraft protection and all this. It makes sense. Makes perfect sense. So for the next several nights, Barb, on his own volition, Flucky takes Barb to recon several Chinese ports. And for the first several times actually, he does this. He doesn't see us, nothing. I mean, he sees like sampans and fishing boats. He doesn't see squat. However, on January 22nd, 1945, he strikes gold. It's Nam Quan Harbor is the name of this place.
Nam Quan, yeah. It's on the east coast of China, north of Formosa, just generally.
And when I say strike gold, I mean strike gold. Bill, what does he see here?
He had 30 ships laying at anchor, basically in 3 lines abreast, with separated by 500 yards apart, so they could swing on their anchor chains and they won't collide with each other. But it's like ducks lined up in a row. This is a shooting gallery. Ducks in a barrel. Use whatever metaphor you want to use. And so, this is going to be easy shooting as long as he can get in without being seen and attacked, and as long as he can get out, when those as long as become the problem.
To give it exactly, it was 11 escorts and 16 cargo ships from 2 separate convoys, convoy MOTA, MOTA-32, and TAMO, TAMO-38, in one harbor. So a guy like Gene Flucky, who was uber aggressive, had to have seen this, and he had to salivate like Pavlov's dog when he saw it.
You're going to break all records, and the target's sort of anchor, right? And so that's what you're thinking. Do I have enough? God, I wish I had more torpedoes. My limitation is going to be in the number of torpedoes I have. Nothing more.
Exactly. So what he wanted to do, and this goes back to what we said in the intro, that he was adventurous, that he was ingenious, and that he was daring almost kind of to a fault. This is one of those points where it's like, but his crew trusted him. What he wanted to do was draw in as close as he dared to the sleeping ships, fire a full spread on the bow, swing around, fire a full spread from the stern, and then hightail it on the surface under the cover of darkness and the hopeful confusion that he would create, a la Dick O'Kane.
Yeah.
That's exactly what O'Kane would do, but these targets were moving. In this case, they're not.
Now let's do the math, though. He's carrying, let's say, at this point, he had maybe 20 torpedoes. I can't remember what the exact number is. But he's going to fire all 6 bow, 4 stern, so that's 10. He's got 10 torpedoes left. But if he reloads, which could take 20, 30 minutes, he's going to die. So he makes the decision, I'm not going to reload. I'm going to fire the 10 I got loaded. And then it's, if I can live to fight another day, I'm happy. So then he's going to get out of there.
Yep. Some on the bridge doubted Gene's plan because of the shallow, uncharted waters and the heavily mined harbor he had pushed into. And by shallow, I mean shallow enough where he literally could not. Yeah, he couldn't submerge
30 feet. He could not submerge, right? He's got to run in and out on the surface. He's hoping it's 30 feet. The fathometer is going to tell him the truth as he goes in and out. But I mean,
exactly. And I think in some places it's shallower than that, wasn't it?
It is. Yeah, it is. And it was not quite scraping the bottom shallow, but it was, close. Again, uncharted. So he doesn't know, am I going to run aground? Am I going to beach the ship? This is what his crew's thinking. You know, if he's he's not saying this, but his crew's thinking, the skipper's going to get us run aground. We're going to be here when the sun rises and we're going to be bombed into oblivion. This is not smart. That's what they're thinking.
Yeah. And they're probably not
something like, luck is where you find it, but to find it, you have to look for it.
Yep. And true to that form, he looked for and found this harbor full of Japanese ships. So at 03:52 hours, Flucky looked through the forward TBT and saw the ships overlapping one another, making for an easy swipe, as we said, with all tubes. As he drew closer at a snail's pace, it became apparent that he couldn't miss at anything he fired at. The targets were just too damn plentiful. There were just too many there. He fired overlapping. Yeah, so you're going to hit something. I don't remember exactly what he said, but he said something along the lines of, I want to make sure that we fire 1 or 2 fish at each target. I don't want to spend any more torpedoes on any one target. I don't want them all to hit the same damn target. That's how close these things were together. So he picked them out along the line.
And what he did is he fired two tubes, shift targets, fire another 2 tubes. Remember, target speed 0. The intercept point is where the target is. There's no calculation required. So this is an easy firing solution. And all you need to do is change bearings from the TBT into the torpedo data computer and then do it again and again. And so you're going to do that 3 times for the 6 bow tubes, 2 fish for each target, swing around and do it twice for the 4 stern tubes.
Mm-hmm. Take us out of here, Bill. What goes on? Tell us the rest of the story here.
It works. It works, right?
It does.
He gets all 10 of his torpedoes out. He swings the of course, he's got the bow swung around to fire the stern tubes. And then he says, all head flank, get the hell out of here. And so, and as he's turning it on, right? Now, again, when you're running at high speed in shallow water, greatly increases the probability of running aground, because even if the fathometer says the water's shoaling, getting shallower, can you stop forward momentum by putting, your stern, by ordering up a stern bell before momentum causes you to run aground? This is high stakes poker here right now. And so, but he did it. He's decided to run an all head flank and try to mimic the course that they used to get in and run the same course to get out, hoping that current doesn't offset them enough to cause them underground.
As he's doing this, Barb is pushing 21 knots, which for a Gato class boat is really stretching its legs. As she's beating feet, the crew can clearly hear, because she's still on the surface now, can clearly hear, boom, 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 boom. And it sounds like machine gun fire. All these torpedoes are hitting within seconds of one another. Mm-hmm. And it's very evident that she has done some significant damage with this full 10 tube spread that she fires here. The crew goes berserk because they knew, that it was a risky operation, and obviously all want to live, but they also want to succeed. And it's very evident that they succeeded in their attack here. As she is hauling ass, she is chased by an escort that had actually worked up steam prior to Barb coming into harbor. The escort begins firing wildly in all directions, doesn't hit Barb, obviously. Barb had tied down, or Flucky had ordered that the chief engineer tie down the governors on the diesels and basically overload the diesels to 150%. Basically, just we're going to run them until they blow because we need to get the hell out of here as fast as we can. Flucky decides that he's going to take the sub through the fleet of Japanese or Chinese junks, fishing boats, in an effort to confuse the escort that is now chasing her, thinking that it's, they're going through junks. There's no way a submarine could go through there, right?
And would the escort that's chasing her fire into this fleet of junks? Right. In order to get, probably, but I mean, that's another consideration.
Yeah. And it just to clarify it, the Japanese do fire into the fleet of junks here, and they're assuming that they're trying to hit the target. Yeah. So as Barb literally plows through the Chinese fishing fleet here, her bow wave and her wake rocks the junks, and they're tossing around like corks in a bathtub. And she eventually, obviously, does make her escape good, eventually getting to the 20-fathom curve where she does plunk down in the water. This is probably the most successful single attack by an American submarine in the war.
Well, certainly Admiral King thought so. He actually wrote a message declaring this the greatest patrol ever, comments. And so, and what comes out of that, of course, is a Medal of Honor for Gene Flucky. I think, do you have a citation handy? Do you remember what it says?
I do, yeah. I do. So she gets credit for 4 ships sunk and 3 damaged, by the way, just so everybody knows. Her final tally for this patrol is uncertain, but it's in between 8 and 10 ships that she sinks, and it's actually probably more. But to your point, his Medal of Honor citation is this, quote, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of USS Barb during her 11th war patrol. Along the east coast of China from December 1945 to February 15th, 1945, after sinking a large ammunition ship and damaging additional tonnage during a 2-hour night battle on 8 January, Commander Flucky, and an exceptional feat of brilliant deduction and bold tracking on 23 January, located a concentration of more than 30 enemy ships in the lower reaches of Mamquan Harbor. Fully aware that a safe retirement would necessitate an hour's run at full speed through the uncharted mined and rock-obstructed waters, he bravely ordered battle station torpedoes. In a daring penetration of the heavy enemy screen and riding in 5 fathoms of water, he launched the Barb's last forward tubes at 3,000 yards. Quickly bringing the ship's stern tubes to bear, he turned loose 4 more torpedoes into the enemy, obtaining 8 direct hits on 6 of the main targets to explode a large ammunition ship and causing inestimable damage by the result of flying shells and other pyrotechnics. Clearing the treacherous area at a high speed, he brought Barb through to safety, and 4 days later, not to be outdone, sank a large Japanese freighter to complete a record of heroic combat achievement, reflecting the highest credit upon Commander Flucky, his gallant officers and men, and the United States Naval Service.
Yeah, and of course, when the CEO gets an award like this, it reflects on the crew. I wouldn't say he felt bad for his crew because of his own recognition, but he did see the Medal of Honor as being representative of the crew's contribution to the war effort. And he wrote handwritten notes to each of his crew members that said, as captain, it has been an outstanding honor to be your representative in accepting the Congressional Medal of Honor for the extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty, which you and every officer and man in Barb displayed. How fortunate I am, how proud I am that the President of the United States should permit me to be the caretaker of this most distinguished honor, which the nation has seen fit to bestow upon a gallant crew and fighting ship, the Barb. Now, it's interesting to note, to look at the photograph of, we didn't talk about this in our preparatory notes, Seth, but to look at the photograph of Flucky receiving the Medal of Honor, because it's not presented by the president.
Right.
It's presented by Forrestal, Secretary of the Navy Forrestal. And I think it's because the president wasn't doing very well at this point,
right.
if from a personal physical standpoint, right? And so, yeah, so that's one of the rare occasions where the Medal of Honor was not presented by the president. But he makes a point here in his note to his crew to say, you know, recognized by the president, even though it wasn't awarded by the president.
Right. And there's something to mention too, and I know you know this, Bill, but we want to say this to the listeners, watchers, whatever. Gene Flucky did not want that medal. You know, most people, with the exception of very few, do not go out to get the Medal of Honor. That is not a goal. Gene Flucky did not want that thing. He did not want that blue ribbon with the white stars. He had no desire to take it. As a matter of fact, he had drawn up a formal letter refusing that Medal of Honor. He did not want it. He felt that if anything, the crew should get something, Presidential Unit Citation, which they do. But he did. Yeah, but he did not want that medal. He felt that the medal should go to those who sacrificed their lives, and not men that live doing that. So again, this just goes to the personality of this guy. But he didn't want it. He had to be ordered to take it. I believe it was not Forrest. I believe it was King who said, "You're going to get this, and you will take it."
Yeah, the standard had been established, and if Flucky didn't get it, then nobody deserved it. You know, that was kind of the thinking. And so, yeah, King did tell him, "This is happening. These are orders, not invitations." So there you go.
This isn't an option. Yeah. So generally, when people receive the Medal of Honor, be the enlisted or officer or whoever, they're pulled out of combat. That's it. You got the blue ribbon. You're done, whether you like it or not. This is one of those exceptions. He had, before he was flown to the United States. Now they're back at Pearl Harbor. Before he was flown to the U.S. to get the medal, he conferred with Admiral Lockwood and said, "I need you to promise me one more patrol," as he called it, his graduation patrol. "I need one more patrol as commander of Barb," because it was recommended at the time by physicians that skippers should not go on any more than 5 war patrols because they were too strenuous. And Flucky indeed had lost a significant amount of weight, not because he was PTSD'd out or anything. He's just a strain of command. He was tired. But he basically made Admiral Lockwood promise him one more patrol after he got the Medal of Honor, which is a rare thing. I don't think any other skipper, sub-skipper, had that opportunity presented to them. We know O'Kane didn't. Did Toronto?
No, I don't think so. Of course, you know,
George Street.
Dick O'Kane received the Medal of Honor after the war ended, so certainly didn't happen there. But yeah, I don't think George Street. I think he was pulled off after his award.
Yeah. So I mean, this is kind of unprecedented, and this is another area in which Gene Flucky and Barb are revolutionaries, and this is really important. This is his last patrol as commander of Barb, and it's also, the war is drawing to an end, so it would have been his last patrol regardless. After returning to Pearl, exactly, we didn't know. Barb was sent to the United States for a long overdue overhaul, major overhaul. She's in Mare Island. While at Mare Island, the yard removed Barb's 4-inch deck gun and they put a 5-inch deck gun on her. But true to form,
the 5-inch was after the sail, the 4-inch was forward of the sail. So yeah, so that she still had the 5-inch, but the 4-inch had found that it was pretty useless with that 5-inch aft. So yeah, he actually tried to get them to not remove the 4-inch. He wanted both guns, but he lost that fight.
But what does he do? What does he request here that no other sub-skipper of World War II requested here?
Well, remember, if you've seen images, videos of amphibious landings at this point of the war, you see a bunch of surface ships firing rocket launchers. These are actually gravity-fed 5-inch in diameter rockets that drop into a feeder and then go ashore into the landing zone, right, to prepare the battlefield, to prepare the beach for the forces that are going to come ashore. And he understood that there was one such rocket launcher available sitting on the beach in Pearl Harbor that was supposed to get loaded on some surface ship, but didn't.
He decides at this point that Barb needs a rocket launcher.
And again, when I said earlier that he's expanding the mission set of the submarine force, this is one example of how he does it. So yeah, he convinces the gunnery officer at Pearl Harbor to load this rocket launcher on the bow where that 4-inch gun was removed from. Now remember, the rockets aren't going to be loaded while the ship is submerged. You've got a surface, go to battle station's rocket. I don't know what he called it. It's probably battle station's gun. But
no, you were right. It was battle station's rockets. No
battle station's rocket was. I didn't remember that. So then you got to haul those rockets out of the ship and load them before you're going to fire them. And these things are kind of limited in scope. Like I said, they drop to this thing. I think he pulled every rocket out of Pearl Harbor that was in the inventory, something like 40, 47, 48 rockets that were in the inventory that he got issued to the Barb. When they didn't even have a place to stow them, below decks. And so he had to figure out, where are we going to store these things? Oh, we're going to store them in our 5-inch gun round racks. So it was invention time. And of course, these things could be set at different trajectory angles, 30 degrees, 35 degrees, 40 degrees. I'm going from memory here. I think that's what it was. And the higher the trajectory, the shorter the range. So depending on how far, and he had these tables that they developed for the surface ships that were shooting these rockets to, tells you how far the rockets would go based on what angle you set the launcher to. So he's inventing tactics here for a submarine.
His Wolfpack days are over. This is his last patrol. He knows this. Such is his sway with Admiral Charles Lockwood. He requests a specific area to patrol and is granted that area. It's back to the Sea of O, as we called it in the first patrol.
Sea of O, that's right.
Yeah, he's granted that area because he has got this fixation on this a cable station that he tried to shell. We neglected to say, in his first patrol as CEO of Barb, they surfaced and tried to shell this cable station, which was basically a communication station. And they couldn't do it because the weather was so foggy, he couldn't see the damn thing. And he had it in the back of his mind. He's like, I'm going to get that damn station. And this is exactly what he sets out to do with these rocket launchers, or rocket launcher, singular, and all these rockets in the Sea of O. So he requests this area. Lockwood says, okay, fine. You got your wish. Go do your damage. Go, and to Lockwood, quote him exactly, says, go raise a rumpus. Because what is going on here is that while Barb is not part of a wolf pack, there are still wolf packs operating, and they're operating in the Sea of Japan. And this is the first time that U.S. submarines are operating in the Sea of Japan since Wahoo was sunk. These submarines, 3 of which, and I don't remember which 3, are exiting the La Perouse Strait, or will be, where Wahoo was sunk. Lockwood needs Barb to basically be a distraction and raise so much havoc that the Japanese don't pay attention to the subs leaving the strait, that they're going after what they think is another wolf pack on the coast of Japan. And that is precisely what Barb does. So June 22nd, 1945, this is late in the war now. Barb had positioned herself 1 mile from the town center of Sherry on the island of Hokkaido. She surfaced with the cry of, to your point, Bill, battle stations, rockets. Fish canneries, sawmills, railroad tracks appeared to be good targets for Barb's first rocket attack. The rocket crew piled on deck, loaded the launcher, and retreated from its blast range with no ships on the horizon. Sampans anchored in the harbor, and the sun rising Gene hollered, "Rockets away." Rockets took off and exploded against targets, causing unknown damage because it was over inside the town. They couldn't see what happened, but they knew something going down. Barb pulled away, having launched the first rocket attack against shore targets in the war and the first ballistic missile attack from a submarine in history.
Yeah.
So, again,
expanding mission set.
Yeah, expand. I mean, the guy was and this was his idea. Let's be clear on this. This was his. Nobody ordered him to do this. Nobody said, "Hey, you know what? This might be a good idea." This was in this man's
There are
head.
a lot of people who had doubts as to whether or not this was a good idea.
Yeah, but it's they do this several more times, don't they, Bill? They continue to go up and down the coast, right?
Yeah, July 2nd, July 4th, Independence Day. Excuse me. He uses rockets, he uses gunfire. He sank some coastal freighters and generally caused mayhem along the coast of Hokkaido and Sakhalin Island, which were under the southern part of which was under Japanese control at this point.
He was causing so much chaos that the Japanese actually believed that there were U.S. carrier night raids being launched against these targets along the Japanese coast. He was raising so much hell that the Japanese firmly believed that American aircraft carriers were launching night raids along the Japanese coast here.
Yeah, in fact, a report went out, a press report went out that an American aircraft carrier conducted a raid against Japanese targets, and a submarine later surfaced and joined the action. So somebody saw somebody saw them, the Barb, and they thought that the Barb was, late to the party, joining the action after the carrier already initiated the raid. None of them knew that this was all Barb.
Yep, all Barb, and the best is yet to come.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, nobody would have assumed that these rounds, which are coming from the above, were gunfire rounds, right? Which are, in these days, the guns were used, both surface ships and submarines, as what we call direct fire weapons rather than indirect fire, which is artillery, where you shoot the artillery round up and it comes back down. That's indirect fire. Direct fire is you're shooting directly into the target. So when these rockets came from above, that's indirect fire. Nobody believed that a submarine could do that. And that's why they were so convinced had to be coming from an aircraft carrier.
Mm-hmm. And you would think, but wouldn't. So,
right.
As I said, the best is yet to come here in terms of audacity and just sheer. I kind of have to think that Gene Flucky was having fun at this point, that he was enjoying himself. Now, on July 19th, 1945, Flucky observed a train traveling along the Sakhalin coast. Seeing this operation, he decided to submerge during the day, surface at night, and gauge a sort of schedule that the trains were running. Basically, he was just going to observe the trains run and see if he could figure out if there was a schedule or if they were just kind of running pell-mell. He wanted to figure if there was a schedule so he could send a landing party ashore to destroy the train. Looking at a map, he realized that this rail line that was running along the coast was supplying it was supplying a good portion of this island. And he figured that if I destroy this rail line, that it's going to strangle this part of the island. I mean, this is tactics that the United States Army used in Europe, that if we destroy this part of the section of the front, then the Germans over here are going to be without supplies. Same thing here. He
Even
didn't
more isolated.
want to.
There were probably multiple rail lines in Europe. There was only this one on Sakhalin.
Uno. That's right, one. Mm-hmm. And to further emphasize it, he didn't want to destroy this rail line with gunfire or rockets. He wanted to destroy it with explosives in a raiding party. Honest to God, a raiding party.
Gunfire, the rockets have a high probability of missing. That's the problem. If you want to be assured that it's going to get destroyed, you've got to put people ashore.
Yeah. Yeah. So explaining his plan to select members of the crew, Gene asked for volunteers for a raiding party. A saboteur team is what he called them. Within minutes, he had more volunteers than he needed. Essentially, the entire crew was like, I want to go. I want to do this.
Yeah.
So he selected the
And
team,
one
and
of the things is when he selected these volunteers, because basically everybody volunteered, he said, I'm going to pick people, but I want all departments on the ship represented. And everybody's got to be unmarried. He made one exception. He did allow one married person, and we'll talk about him in a moment. And he wanted at least half of them to be Boy Scouts. And he was an Eagle Scout himself, hailed to Eagle Scouts. I'm a National Eagle Scout Association life member. So give it to the Eagle Scouts. But, those were the criteria. All departments represented, unmarried, except for Hatfield. We'll talk about him in a moment. And at least half had to be Boy Scouts because he knew they understood land navigation. And if they got stuck, they could find their way out of there. And they knew first aid and things like that because, again, there's only one pharmacist, mate, Slant Corman, on the submarine, and he was not going to allow him to go.
Nope. And those crewmen that were selected, the team were, and I'm going to read their names out right quick in case any of their family members are listening. Chief Gunner's Mate Paul G. Saunders, Swish Saunders, he was the chief of the boat. Electrician's Mate Third Class Billy Hatfield. Signalman Second Class Francis Neil Seaver. Ship's Cook First Class Lawrence Newland. Torpedoman's Mate Third Class Edward Klingsmith. Motor Machinist Mate Second Class James Richard. Motor Machinist Mate First Class John Markison. And Lieutenant William M. Walker. He dubbed these guys the Barb-arians. Think about that for a second.
The Barb-arians, yeah.
Which
by
is
the way,
awesome.
I had a sailor named Markison on one of my ships when I'm working for me. And one of the first questions I asked, did you have an uncle on the Barb or grandfather or something? And he said he didn't know anything about it, so it wasn't related. But yeah.
Well, that would have been cool. It would have been cool if it was.
Would have, yeah.
So these men would be set ashore via rubber boat, and they would be the first ever people to attack mainland Japan in World War, that home islands in World War II.
Said differently, this was the only ground operation in Japan homeland during the entire war. Let that sink in. It was the only ground assault attack on Japanese homeland during the entire war. And it was done from a submarine.
Yep. You wanted to talk about Hatfield. Who was he?
Hatfield was an electrician's mate. He was I think he might have even been cross-rated as an engineman, but he'd been an electrician's mate. And he'd worked on the railroad, West Virginia Railroad, before the war. And he had an intimate knowledge of tracks and trains and how much the rail compressed when a train ran over the rail, because this was critical. What they were going to do is they were going to take the ship's own scuttle charges. You say, why does a ship have explosives on it? Every ship has explosives on it in case you have to sink the ship, scuttle the ship. So they took these 55 pounds of torpedoes explosives that they would have used to scuttle the ship if it came to that. And Hatfield devised what we call today a micro switch, a compression switch that would get compressed by the rail. So they'd have to dig underneath the metal part of the rail a little bit and put this under the rail. And he had to understand not too little, so the sucker explodes while we're trying to hook it up, and not too much, free play in that switch, so that when the train runs over, it doesn't push it enough to make it explode. You had to get it exactly right with the amount of play in that switch. And the switch would explode the detonator, which would explode this Torpex charge, which would, in theory, derail the train and basically destroy the track that the train was running on, and thereby end that supply route for everything north of on Sakhalin Island of this that was being supplied by that train.
Yeah, I'd say it ended. So At midnight on July 23rd, Barb surfaced and launched her rubber boats filled with her Barb-arians. 30 minutes after launching, the boats had been dragged ashore. So it took them a little while to get out there. The saboteurs immediately ran. Yeah, it was pretty good ways. It was pretty good ways. They immediately ran into trouble, and not trouble like you would think. They got lost, frankly, because the night was pitch black. They couldn't see squat, and they had no idea of the terrain. So I mean, it was a very risky operation, frankly.
Yeah,
altogether.
Didn't have good ground maps and no night vision goggles for those of us later. Yeah.
No. They crossed the beach. They ran past a house with a dog in it, by the way, and the dog going bananas when he hears these people run by. The Barb-arians made their way across a road and fell into two separate 4-foot deep trenches, like culverts, ditches, if you will. Extricating themselves, they made their way to the tracks and began to dig and plant the explosive charge. Now,
by the way, one of the sailors climbed up what he thought was a water tower to keep lookout as they were doing the digging and setting up of the charge. And it turns out the water tower was a watchtower, and there was a lookout in it, but he was asleep. He slept during the entire event until the explosion, one would presume, until the thing went boom.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of luck involved in this, frankly.
Yeah.
Once they planted the charge, they ran away, literally. And I mean, like, knee to chest, as they say. From the planted charge, the men made their way back to the beach, flashed a signal to Barb via flashlight, and to tell Barb that they were done, that they were getting the hell out of there, and they were ready to get back aboard. As the raiding party was moving back to the sub, a train approached. Grabbing his megaphone, Gene yelled, quote, "Paddle like the devil." And he said that he watched the guys in the boat. Their arms looked like egg beaters when he said that.
Yeah.
He said that they were moving.
Yeah.
At 0147, the train reached the explosive charge and erupted. The train's boilers blew, wreckage flew everywhere, cars piled up, some rolled off the track afire. 12 freight cars, 2 passenger cars, and a mail car derailed and piled into a twisted mass. Japanese propaganda claimed that civilian passengers were killed, but intelligence indicates that the trains traveling that night were carrying military convoy troops only. This is claimed as the only ground combat on the Japanese home islands during World War II, and they were conducted by submariners from the USS Barb.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Look, I can imagine a scene from a movie where the protagonist says, "Do you think you had enough explosive, Bob?" Yeah, it was a massive charge.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. That's what you're talking about.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. That's a good example. Right?
Enough explosives, Butch. So thus pretty much ends Barb's last patrol. She does conduct several more rocket attacks as she sinks some fishing trawlers here and there. And she's headed to Midway and arrives on August 2nd, 1945, ending her war.
Let me put a footnote in this. So before she goes back home, she has shot all her torpedoes. She's fired all her rockets. She shot all her gun ammunition, and then even rammed a trawler to sink it before returning home. She's got no weapons left.
Yep.
And just like, what else could you ask? And this is not the patrol that King called the greatest patrol in history. This is this would be like in the top 5.
Yeah. I mean, this is it reads like something, if you didn't know it to be true, that it would be something that somebody made up. If you saw it in a movie, which is much disdain for most of us have for Hollywood today, if you saw this in a movie today, you'd be like, man, that's just another Hollywood piece of trash.
It's fiction. Yep.
But it ain't.
No,
it is not. The war ends, so she gets back to Midway. What did I say? August 2nd, 1945. Of course, the bomb is dropped on the 6th and another one on the 9th, and then the Japanese surrender, and the war ends on the September 1945 on the decks of the Missouri. Barb's influence and Flucky's influence on submarines, Bill, still reaches, and you can talk to this with direct personal knowledge. Yeah.
Absolutely. Again, I've been disassociated with the submarine force since 2006, from uniform days. Loosely associated, I would say now, for the last 20 years or so. And so I don't know that they do it the way they did it through 2006 when I retired. But my goodness, during my tenure, which, commissioned in 79, retired in 2006, Gene Flucky and the USS Barb was front and center in every one of our conversations.
For good reason, too.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the man was a legendary leader. He was legendary in his tactics. He was legendary in his aggressiveness. And, I mean, the fact that he decided he wanted to launch rockets from a submarine, you cannot tell me that did not directly influence the ballistic missile submarines that we have today. It had to.
Absolutely. Before that, the regular submarines. But I mean, we figured out a way to launch rockets as a deliberate mission, not just as a pickup game.
Right. He's definitely worthy of an entire very long episode that we'll just say.
Mm-hmm.
But
and by the way, he didn't retire for a long time. He retired as a rear admiral, but he had something to do with the development of the Polaris program, the Polaris ballistic missile program, and a whole bunch of other things before he retired. He served as commander of Submarine Force Pacific Fleet before he retired. So he had a very illustrious uniformed career that didn't end when the war ended.
No. And he's a hero through and through. I don't know if we could add anything more to the conversation than we've already added. Bill, do you have anything you want to throw in?
I don't. Yeah, we could read this entire book, right? And so
yeah.
I don't think we're going to do that. But there's so much great stuff in Eugene's book, and the histories that have come out since the war that it's really worth your read.
And that's we get a lot of comments to recommend books. Read his book. It's called Thunder Below by Eugene Flucky. Get it, read it, and you read it and you're like, oh, these are recollections of an old man. No, well, I mean, they are, but they're confirmed to be accurate and true. So, there's some books that are written as I like to call the vanity press. This ain't one of them. This is a book that was written by the man who did the actions, and they were confirmed by his crewmen. They're confirmed by the United States Navy and the Japanese. So this is verbatim truth as it happened. If you haven't read it, get it on Amazon, check it out and read it. It's a hell of a story. It's an adventure story, honest to God.
Yeah.
So
good way to put it,
Bill. It's a good way to wrap it up, I think. And if you're good with it, I'm going to do that very thing right now.
You bet.
So with that, we want to thank you for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. As I said at the beginning of the video, check us out on YouTube, like and subscribe. Please do so. If you have a question, send us an email at unauthorizedhistoryofthepacificwarpodcast@gmail.com. And once again, my name is Seth Parrott, and I want to thank you very much for listening. Bill.
I'm Bill Tody, and we'll see you again next week.